Imagine for a second being handed an extra 34 years of life.
Just completely out of nowhere.
Right. A completely unexpected, fully funded second act to your existence. You get to actually see your grandchildren grow up, maybe even your great-grandchildren.
Which is, by every conceivable metric, an absolute miracle of human development.
It really is. But here is the catch. The exact same economic engine that gave you those 3 extra decades is, at the exact same time, pumping toxic, microscopic particulate matter directly into your lungs.
Actively threatening to claw those extra years right back.
Exactly. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are unpacking what we call the prosperity paradox. And we've got this massive, really fascinating stack of macroeconomic, demographic, and environmental data specifically tracking upper middle income countries.
Or UMCs, as we'll probably call them today.
Right, UMCs. We're talking about a group of nations that have pulled off, frankly, the greatest leap in human wealth in recorded history.
Only to find themselves staring down the barrel of a complete demographic collapse and, well, total environmental exhaustion.
It's a heavy topic, but it's so vital for you to understand because it shapes the entire global economy you interact with every day.
Yeah.
And looking at the report they sent over for this, which, by the way, the design of this slide deck is intensely minimalist.
Oh, yeah. It's very striking.
It really is. It's got this stark, pure white background,
Yeah.
pure hex code white.
Very clinical.
Yeah, and they use this very specific muted academic gray for the text and this sharp data blue for the positive trends. No flashy pictures, no 3D graphics, just flat 2D charts.
Which I honestly prefer. It forces you to just look at the raw numbers.
Me too. And the very first visual they hit you with is this massive contrast. On the left side of the canvas, there's this steep upward trending blue line. That's the absolute explosion in wealth and human lifespan over the last few decades.
But then on the right side, there's this looming, expanding gray shadow.
Right, representing the spiking carbon emissions and the vanishing population dividend, and they just connect the two with this massive black question mark.
Because that is the defining bottleneck of human development right there. We tend to view economic development as this triumphant linear journey, right? You start poor, you build some factories, you get rich, and then you just sort of relax into prosperity.
Like reaching the finish line of a marathon.
Exactly. But the mechanics of this transition reveals something much darker. Going from low income to upper middle income is, relatively speaking, the straightforward part. The true crisis, the trap, is what happens the moment you arrive.
And to understand that trap, I think we first have to understand the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of the leap these countries took. We're talking about an economic expansion that essentially rewired the gravity of global trade.
It really did. Let's look at the foundational numbers on the second page of this deck.
Okay, so they have this incredibly clean, minimalist area chart here.
Right. And decades ago, the gross domestic product of these UMC countries in current U.S. dollars sat at a baseline of roughly $16 billion.
Which is wild. I mean, $16 billion is a rounding error for a modern tech giant today.
It's nothing. But back then, that was the total economic output of entire nations. And today, that number approaches the $30 trillion threshold.
Trillion, with a T.
With a T. And look at how the chart highlights it. There's this simple single color upward arrow, and they've used these very thin red circles to mark the exact moments the curve broke through the $10 trillion and $20 trillion marks.
Mostly right after the year 2000. But, to really grasp what that means, we should just look at the raw nominal GDP, right?
Yeah.
Because currency values fluctuate constantly.
Precisely. We need to look at purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Let's break that down for the listener really quickly. Yeah. PPP basically adjusts for the actual cost of living on the ground, right?
Yeah, it measures what a dollar actually buys in a local market.
Like how a cup of coffee costs way less in Bogota than it does in Manhattan.
Exactly. It equalizes the purchasing power. And when you apply that lens, the per capita GDP in these nations broke through 21,000 international dollars. This wasn't just a localized boom, it's a geometric progression. They transformed from being mere exporters of raw materials, mining copper, cutting timber, growing coffee, into the central nervous system of global manufacturing.
I always struggle with numbers this large. I think the human brain just isn't wired to feel the difference between a billion and a trillion. It just sounds like a lot.
It does.
So let me offer you, the listener, a tangible way to think about this growth. If I asked you to sit in a room and wait for 1 million seconds to pass, you'd be in there for about 11 and a half days.
Which is a long time, but doable.
Right. You could bring some books,
Hmm.
maybe treat it like a weird silent retreat.
Yeah.
Now, if I asked you to wait 1 billion seconds, you wouldn't leave that room for almost 32 years.
A massive jump.
But if I asked you to wait 1 trillion seconds, you would be sitting in that room for over 31,000 years.
Wow. Put it that way. It really shifts your perspective.
I mean, the pyramids of Giza are only about 4,500 years old. So when we say their GDP went from 16 billion to nearly 30 trillion, we are not talking about a really good fiscal quarter. We are witnessing the birth of an entirely new economic universe.
And that new universe exerts immense gravitational pull. When you suddenly manifest tens of trillions of dollars in value, you fundamentally change the flow of goods globally.
Because they become massive consumers themselves, right?
Exactly. These UMCs became massive consumer markets in their own right. They started dictating global commodity prices. If they needed steel to build cities, the global price of iron ore skyrocketed.
Because they were buying all of it.
Right. But what is truly fascinating, and we see this on the next slide, is how that abstract wealth materialized into the physical human body.
Yes, the health dividend. This is the part of the data that really, truly stops you in your tracks. Because $30 trillion is just paper and digital ledgers at the end of the day.
Right. It's just math.
But the profound human benefit of this wealth is life itself. Look at this smooth data blue line chart here. Total life expectancy at birth in these nations leaped from a grim 41.9 years to 76.1 years.
They actually drew a horizontal dash line between those 2 points with a little text box that just says, plus 34.2 years of life.
Just think about the psychology of that for a second. If you live in a society where the average person dies before their 42nd birthday, your entire culture is different.
Your perception of time, of risk, of family structure, it's all built around urgency.
Exactly. You have children as early as possible. You put them to work on the farm as early as possible because you absolutely need the labor before your own body gives out.
The time horizon of your life is incredibly compressed.
Right. But giving people an extra 3 decades, you aren't just extending life. You are entirely changing what it means to be human in that society. You get a middle age, you get a retirement.
And we have to look at the mechanics of how they bought those 34 years, because it wasn't just a matter of building a few fancy hospitals in the capital cities for the elite.
No, the data shows something much more fundamental.
The most dramatic driver of that life expectancy jump is the absolute plummeting of infant and child mortality.
Right, because mathematically, if a large percentage of babies die before age 1, it drags the statistical average of the whole population's life expectancy way, way down to 42.
Even if the adults who do survive childhood end up living to be 60 or 70.
Exactly. So how do you actually stop babies from dying on that scale?
That $30 trillion funded massive, unglamorous public works projects. We are talking about laying thousands of miles of subterranean pipes for clean drinking water.
Which changes everything.
The exact moment a village gets piped, chlorinated water, diseases like cholera and dysentery basically evaporate.
It's instant. And I imagine it funded modern sewage systems too, so human waste wasn't contaminating the water table to begin with.
Yes. And crucially, it funded cold chain logistics.
Meaning refrigerators and trucks that can transport vaccines.
Exactly. You can get vaccines to deeply rural areas without them spoiling in the heat. When you eradicate preventable childhood diseases through those networks, your life expectancy average shoots upward like a rocket.
But here's the thing, giving people 30 extra years of life creates a massive logistical problem for a country. You can't just have millions of people working in backbreaking subsistence farming until they're 76 years old.
No, their bodies would literally break.
Right. To sustain that kind of lifespan and to sustain the economic engine that funds the clean water and the vaccines in the first place, you need a completely different type of economy.
And that means you have to completely rewire the human capital of the nation.
Which brings us to the 4th slide. The end of youth illiteracy.
And this chart is fascinating. It's a dumbbell chart showing the gap closing. When parents know their children are actually going to survive to adulthood, and when they themselves expect to live to see a pension, their entire investment strategy changes.
They stop viewing their kids as immediate agricultural labor.
Right. They start viewing them as long-term investments. And this is perfectly reflected in the youth literacy data. We are looking at the 15 to 24 age bracket here.
Okay, let me read this. Their literacy rate climbed from a baseline of just 3.5% up to, wow,
to an astonishing 99.2%.
They've got a little red circle highlighting that 99.2% right at the end of the chart. Universal literacy. It's really hard to overstate what a paradigm shift that is.
It changes the fabric of reality for those people.
It does. When your literacy rate is 3.5%, reading is basically a magical power. It's hoarded by a tiny group of elite males, usually religious clerics or royalty or the very wealthy.
But when it hits 99.2%, the society fundamentally transforms.
And what's the most important metric hidden inside that 99.2%?
The total eradication of the gender gap in basic education. Think about it. When you are at 3.5% overall literacy, almost zero women can read.
None.
But by approaching 100%, you have suddenly, in the span of a generation, unlocked the economic potential of half of your entire population.
Let's follow the logic of that for a second. If I'm running a developing nation and I suddenly educate tens of millions of young women, I haven't just doubled my workforce. I've completely changed the internal power dynamics of my country.
You've revolutionized the household economy. Millions of young women moved out of unpaid domestic labor or subsistence farming, and they entered the formal economy.
They started earning actual paychecks.
Yes. And decades of data tell us that when women control capital, household spending patterns change dramatically. Investment in child nutrition goes up. Investment in higher education for the next generation goes up.
It's a massive multiplier effect.
Huge. But from a macroeconomic perspective, if you can read, you can be trained to do almost anything. You can manage a supply chain database. You can operate a complex computer numerical control machine in a factory. You can work in banking.
Which perfectly explains the next massive structural shift we see in this report. Slide 5. The service sector takeover.
The structural reshaping.
Right. You have this newly literate, highly capable workforce. You obviously can't just send them back out to the rice paddies.
No, it would be a massive waste of human capital.
Looking at this stacked area chart, again, purely 2D, keeping with that academic gray and data blue theme, the data shows that services value added, calculated in constant 2015 dollars, approached a staggering $17.4 trillion.
With a simple upward arrow showing the service sector dominating the whole economic pie?
The agricultural wedge of the economy shrank to almost nothing comparatively, while industry and services just exploded.
It is the standard evolutionary path of an economy. You start with agriculture, which is basically extracting calories from the dirt.
Right.
Then you leverage your cheap labor to move into industry and manufacturing, making physical things. But a modern $30 trillion manufacturing hub is incredibly complex.
You can't just have a bunch of isolated factories.
Exactly. You cannot run thousands of factories without an oceanic service sector to support it all.
It's like the evolution of a biological organism. Agriculture is the pure muscle, just brute force energy. But as the organism gets bigger and more complex, it needs a central nervous system to direct the muscle.
That's a great way to put it.
The service sector, banking, insurance, telecommunications, logistics, IT support, is that nervous system. It optimizes the muscle, and frankly, it captures the lion's share of the actual monetary value.
And when the rest of the global economy looked at these UMCs in the 1990s and 2000s, they saw something completely irresistible.
They saw dollar signs.
Oh, absolutely. They saw a massive, young, highly literate workforce that was suddenly living longer, supported by a rapidly modernizing service sector. And crucially, these workers were still relatively cheap to hire compared to workers in the US or Europe.
It was the ultimate global arbitrage opportunity.
Precisely. Which is why we see the data on foreign direct investment, or FDI, go absolutely parabolic on slide 6.
Let me look at that bar chart. Okay, wow. We are tracking net inflows blasting from a nominal $100 million in the early days to peaks exceeding $570 billion annually.
They've got these thin red circles around the peaks, specifically those years breaking the $500 billion mark. They call it the period of deep capital fusion.
$570 billion of foreign capital pouring in every single year. Let's really unpack the mechanism of that capital fusion for the listener. Why did multinationals from London, Tokyo, and New York trip over themselves to build factories in these specific UMC countries? Why not somewhere else?
Because these UMCs offered the perfect trifecta. Think about it. If you are a multinational electronics company, you don't want to build a billion-dollar fabrication plant in a low-income country with no paved roads, frequent power outages, and an illiterate workforce that can't read the safety manuals.
Right, that's just a recipe for disaster.
But you also don't want to build it in a high-income country where the labor unions will demand $40 an hour and 6 weeks of paid vacation.
So the UMCs are the Goldilocks zone.
Exactly. These upper middle income countries hit the sweet spot. They had the physical infrastructure to get your goods to the port. They had the literate youth to assemble the microchips without breaking them. And they had the raw scale to absorb massive, multi-billion-dollar investments.
They effectively vacuumed up the entire world's manufacturing capacity.
They really did.
Okay, so we've built this beautiful, high-speed economic engine. The GDP is soaring into the tens of trillions. People are reading. They're living to be 76. And $500 billion of investment is flowing in annually.
It sounds like a utopia.
It does. But every single engine has an exhaust pipe. And this is where the story and this data takes a very dark turn. Because all of this hypergrowth required fuel.
You don't conjure $30 trillion out of thin air.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
And that fuel has plunged these nations into a severe, potentially catastrophic environmental deficit.
We have to look at the carbon cost. If you turn to slide 7, there's a staircase line chart here. The data shows per capita CO2 emissions. And this is specifically excluding land use change and forestry spiking from around 1 ton per person to over 6.7 tons per person.
There's this steep dashed red arrow just driving the point home.
The trajectory of total greenhouse gas emissions is essentially a sheer cliff face heading upward. When economists analyze this specific period, they point to what's called the strong coupling of GDP growth and carbon emissions.
Meaning that for every single dollar of wealth created, a very predictable, very heavy amount of carbon was released into the atmosphere. They were totally glued together.
Yes. The wealth creation in this specific era was fundamentally, unavoidably carbon intensive. They didn't build this economic miracle on solar panels and wind farms.
Because they couldn't.
Right. They built it by burning mountains of coal, rivers of oil, and oceans of natural gas. They built it on cement production and steel smelting.
Which are two of the most carbon-heavy industrial processes on Earth.
Exactly. They built it on fleets of diesel cargo ships and millions of fossil fuel-powered trucks running 24/7.
Let me push back on the moral judgment that often accompanies these statistics, though. We sit here today, right, with our advanced green tech, our EVs, and we look at that 6.7 tons per capita, and we cringe. We call it an environmental disaster.
And ecologically it is?
Sure, ecologically. But was this a reckless, malicious disregard for the planet by these countries? Or was it simply the unavoidable mathematics of survival?
That's the core of the paradox.
Right. If you are a premier or a president in one of these countries in, say, 1995, and you have to choose between your citizens starving in the dark today or the global temperature rising by a degree in 30 years.
You burn the coal.
Every single time.
You burn every lump of coal you can physically dig out of the ground to build the hospitals and the schools. Was there any other way for them to do it back then? That is the tragic reality of the prosperity paradox. No, there was no scalable alternative at the time. Green technology in the 90s and early 2000s was vastly too expensive and terribly inefficient to power rapid industrialization on a scale of billions of people.
Just wasn't an option.
It wasn't malice. It was the brutal logic of human development. You leverage the absolute cheapest, most energy-dense resource available to break the cycle of poverty.
Which was coal and oil.
Exactly. But, and this is the critical pivot here, recognizing why they had to do it does not grant them immunity from the physical consequences of what they did.
Because physics doesn't care about your economic justification.
Physics does not care at all. And those physical consequences are playing out right now, today, in the lungs of the very people who are supposed to benefit from this wealth.
Which brings us to slide 8, the air quality data, specifically PM 2.5. This is where the environmental deficit becomes a visceral, biological crisis for the listener to understand.
Yes. PM 2.5 refers to fine particulate matter.
And we really need to be clear about what that actually is, because these aren't just, specks of dust that make you cough or give you a scratchy throat for a day.
No, not at all.
At 2.5 microns or less in width, these particles are infinitesimally small. They are roughly 30 times smaller than the diameter of a single human hair.
Which means your body's natural filters can't catch them.
Exactly. When you breathe them in, they don't just sit in your lungs. They're so small, they bypass your respiratory system's natural defenses, they cross the alveolar membrane, and they absorb directly into your bloodstream, almost acting like a gas.
And once they are in the bloodstream, they trigger massive systemic inflammation. They cause plaque buildup in the arteries. They can even cross the blood-brain barrier.
Which is terrifying. And the bar chart here shows that the annual average exposure to PM 2.5 in these UMCs hovered chronically between 35 and 41 micrograms per cubic meter.
And notice the dashed line they put at the bottom of the chart.
Right, the World Health Organization's safe guideline, which is 10.
10 micrograms.
And there's a red circle highlighting the massive gap between the WHO guideline and the reality. So these populations have been living, working, and breathing in an environment that is consistently 4 times the maximum safe limit for human health.
For decades.
This is the cruelest irony of the entire data set to me. Think back to the health dividend we discussed earlier, the 34 extra years of life.
Yeah.
These countries spent decades, burned billions of tons of coal, and sacrificed their environment to buy their citizens those 34 years. And now, the exact byproduct of that wealth, the toxic air, is threatening to claw those years right back.
You see massive spikes in chronic respiratory diseases, cardiovascular failure, and early onset dementia directly tied to this air pollution.
And the medical costs of treating a chronically ill, aging population will absolutely cannibalize the wealth they just created.
You simply cannot maintain a highly productive, innovative service sector if your workforce is chronically sick. But, it isn't just the air. The data on slide 9 points to a massive systemic drawdown of natural capital across the board. The metric we look at here is called adjusted savings regarding natural resource depletion.
Let me look at this area chart.
It expresses the cost of resource depletion as a percentage of gross national income, or GNI. And we see it spiking to alarming peak percentages, hitting high warning points of 6.6%.
They have got a red circle right at that 6.6% peak. Let's explain this concept of natural capital to the listener, because I think it exposes a massive flaw in how we typically measure economic success.
It definitely does.
Let's say I own a massive plot of land with an ancient old-growth forest on it. That forest provides immense ecological value, right? Water filtration, carbon sequestration, soil stability.
But under traditional GDP metrics, that living forest is technically worth $0.
Exactly. It's worth zero until I destroy it. If I chop down every single tree, sell the timber, and turn the land into a barren dirt lot, suddenly my GDP skyrockets. The economy looks like it's absolutely booming.
But your actual national wealth has decreased. You've liquidated an irreplaceable asset for short-term cash.
Right.
What the adjusted savings data reveals is that a significant portion of this so-called economic miracle was subsidized by aggressively overdrawing the environmental bank account.
It wasn't just transient pollution that blows away in the wind.
No, it was the irreversible liquidation of natural assets. We are talking about severe topsoil degradation, the draining of ancient fossil aquifers that took millions of years to fill, and the total destruction of biodiversity.
And you can only run that play once.
Once the natural capital is converted to cash, the interest stops compounding and the principal is gone forever.
So the environment is completely tapped out, the air is toxic, the water tables are dropping, and the cheap energy phase is definitively over.
Which sounds like a crisis on its own.
It sounds like an existential crisis.
Yeah.
But the data reveals a secondary crisis that is arguably even more terrifying, because it strikes at the very engine of the economy itself.
The people.
We are talking about the people. The massive, booming young workforce that made these countries the factory floor of the world is rapidly vanishing. We are entering the realm of the demographic time bomb.
And this is where the math of macroeconomics becomes truly ruthlessly unforgiving. Let's look at slide 10. The foundational block of any population is the total fertility rate.
Which is the average number of children born to a woman over her lifetime.
Right. Over this period of hypergrowth, the fertility rate in these UMCs completely collapsed. This dual-line chart shows it going from over 4.6 children per woman down to just 1.47.
They have a heavy downward arrow pointing right at that 1.47 circled in red. Let's pause on that number for a second. 1.47.
It's shockingly low.
For a population to just stay stable, meaning no growth, no shrinkage, just perfectly replacing the people who naturally die, you need a fertility rate of 2.1.
The replacement rate.
Right. So these countries aren't just slowing down, they are in a steep structural demographic contraction. But wait, if these people are richer, healthier, and living longer than ever before, shouldn't they be having more kids?
You would think so.
I mean, they can actually afford to feed them now.
It seems completely counterintuitive, but it's actually one of the most ironclad laws of human development. We call it the demographic transition.
Okay, how does that work?
Wealth and urbanization reliably destroy fertility. When a society moves from the rural farm to the dense city, the entire economic calculus of having a child completely flips.
Oh, because on a farm, a child is free labor.
Exactly. They help with the harvest. But in a high-density urban apartment in a major city, a child is a massive financial liability.
There are just mouths to feed and tuitions to pay.
Right. Add in the fact that, as we discussed, women are now universally literate, entering the workforce and pursuing long-term careers.
The opportunity cost of leaving the workforce to have 3 or 4 children becomes astronomically high for them.
And the immediate consequence of this fertility collapse is glaringly visible in the youth demographic data on the same chart. The 0 to 14 age group plummeted from over 40% of the total population to around 20.2%.
It literally halved.
Cut right in half.
Think of society as a physical structure, like a pyramid. The broad, heavy base of the pyramid is the youth. It supports the entire weight of the structure above it. We just watched half of the stone blocks at the very bottom vanish into thin air.
And you can't support the top of a structure if the base is shrinking.
No, it collapses.
Yeah.
And in this analogy, the top of the pyramid is the elderly population. Which brings us to slide 11. The silver tsunami.
While the youth base was halving, the 65 and older population surged from roughly 3.5% to 12.0%.
Looking at this line chart with the marker points, it rapidly crossed the 7% threshold, which they've circled here.
Right. Demographers officially classify 7% as an aging society.
And then it just blows right past the 10% mark. They've labeled this whole upward slope the accelerated aging phase.
Because it's exactly what it is.
Okay, explain the math of a national pension and healthcare system to me under these conditions.
Yeah.
Because when I look at those numbers, jumping from 3% to 12% elderly while the youth halves, it seems like a localized apocalypse for government budgets.
It is a macroeconomic terror. Honestly, it keeps finance ministers awake at night because pension and public health care systems are essentially giant intergenerational wealth transfers.
The young pay for the old.
Exactly. They operate on a ratio.
Yeah.
When these UMCs were booming, they were enjoying what we call a demographic dividend. They had a massive bulge of working age adults, say 6 or 7 young workers paying taxes for every 1 retiree drawing a pension.
The system was just flush with cash.
Completely flush.
It's really easy to promise generous retirement benefits to your citizens when the people paying into the system outnumber the people receiving the money 7 to 1.
But a demographic dividend is a one-time demographic anomaly. It only happens during the gap between infant mortality dropping and fertility rates dropping.
And when fertility drops.
The pipeline of new workers dries up.
Right.
Now, the math reverses entirely. You have a shrinking pool of working-age people being heavily taxed to support an exploding pool of retirees.
Retirees who are, thanks to the health dividend we talked about, living longer than ever and requiring decades of highly expensive medical care.
Which brings us to slide 12, and possibly the most chilling visual in the entire data set.
The scissors effect.
Yeah?
Imagine a graph. One line traces the percentage of the available working age population, the 15 to 64 demographic. That line climbed for decades, peaked at roughly 70%, and is now flatlined and begun to arc downwards.
Now, draw a second line representing the elderly dependency ratio, the burden of retirees on those workers.
That line is arcing steeply upward, and right where those two lines intersect, the pivot point of the scissors, which they've circled in a dashed red line here, is where the economic magic trick ends.
The structural trap snaps shut at that exact intersection. The demographic dividend that made these UMCs so incredibly attractive to hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign direct investment, it is effectively over.
Because the endless supply of young, cheap, literate factory workers has just dried up.
And here's the brutal reality of economics. As labor becomes scarce, it becomes expensive.
Right, supply and demand. And that rising cost of labor triggers the phenomenon that development economists dread the most. The middle income trap. Let's break down exactly how this trap works for the listener, because it's the central dilemma of our entire deep dive today.
The middle income trap occurs when a country loses its competitive edge in the export of manufactured goods, because its wages have risen, but is unable to keep up with more developed economies in the high value-added market.
Let me make sure I have this perfectly right. Because their wages went up, they can no longer compete with the poorer countries, say, emerging markets in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia.
Right, because those countries are more than happy to sew T-shirts and assemble cheap plastics for $2 a day.
So the multinational corporations will simply pack up their factories and move to where the labor is cheaper.
They will ruthlessly chase the cheapest labor.
But simultaneously, these UMCs haven't yet mastered the bleeding-edge technology required to compete with the high-income nations like Germany, Japan, or the U.S.
Exactly. They can't just casually pivot and start dominating the global market for semiconductor lithography machines or advanced aerospace engineering.
So they are squeezed from the bottom by cheaper labor and blocked from the top by superior technology.
They're stuck in the middle.
And they are stuck there while simultaneously trying to fund the healthcare of a rapidly aging population and clean up a literal environmental disaster zone.
Historically, many countries reach this exact point and just stagnate for decades. They never make the jump to high income status.
That paints an incredibly bleak picture. I mean, we have environmental exhaustion, toxic air, a shrinking workforce, crushing pension burdens, and the departure of foreign manufacturing.
It's the ultimate bottleneck.
But human beings, especially at the scale of nation-states, are intensely resourceful. These countries aren't just shrugging their shoulders and accepting economic collapse.
Not at all.
If the cheap labor is gone and the cheap, dirty energy is no longer viable, how do you actually break out of the middle income trap?
You have to execute a total structural pivot. You have to move from a factor-driven economy to an innovation-driven economy.
What is the fundamental difference between those two?
A factor-driven economy grows by throwing more raw inputs at a problem. You want more GDP. You throw more cheap labor into the factory. You shovel more coal into the furnace. You clear-cut more forests.
It's just brute force.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as we've established, they are out of cheap labor, out of cheap coal, and out of forest.
So what's the alternative?
An innovation-driven economy grows by finding radically better, smarter, more efficient ways to use inputs. You don't build more microchips, you invent a totally new architecture for a microchip that makes it twice as fast using half the energy.
Ah, I see. And the data shows these UMCs are frantically trying to force this exact evolution. Let's look at slide 13, the research and development metrics.
This is a dual-axis chart.
Right, we've got a bar chart for R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP, jumping from 0.6% to 2.1%.
Right.
Now, in casual conversation, a 1.5% bump doesn't sound earth-shattering.
It sounds tiny.
But when you apply that percentage to a $30 trillion GDP, you are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars being redirected.
That is an absolute ocean of capital being poured into national laboratories, university research grants, and high-tech incubators.
And that capital is yielding hard, measurable results.
Looking at the line graph overlaid on this chart, we see resident patent applications skyrocketing from under 40,000 to over 1.4 million.
And they have an upward arrow emphasizing the strong positive correlation here. You pour the capital into elite human capital generation funding PhDs, building research hubs, and you get the patents out. They've actually added a text box here that says innovation-driven replaces factor-driven. And these aren't just vanity patents, right?
No, these represent proprietary algorithms, advanced robotics, new synthetic materials, and green energy technology. This is the only proven ladder out of the middle income trap.
You literally have to invent your way out.
You have to own the intellectual property. It's the difference between being the factory that physically assembles the smartphone for a tiny, razor-thin profit margin and being the company that designs the smartphone and captures 90% of the profit.
But here's the massive logistical hurdle with that. You cannot just invent a revolutionary new AI-driven smart grid or an autonomous logistics network and run it on 1980s infrastructure.
It will crash immediately.
Right. You have to upgrade the physical and digital world to match the ambition of your patents, which explains the explosive data we see on slide 14 regarding infrastructure.
It's a grid pictogram showing two sides of this upgrade.
Yeah, on the left, we see exponential, almost vertical growth in mobile cellular network subscriptions and broadband penetration. And on the physical side, on the right, we see container port traffic breaking 370 million TEUs.
20-foot equivalent units.
370 million shipping containers. The scale of physical goods movement is just staggering. They've circled the latest throughput data right here to emphasize how central they are to the global supply chain.
It really is.
It's like they are trying to swap out the engine of a commercial jetliner while it's in mid-flight at 30,000 feet. They are frantically upgrading the underlying hardware of the country while the software is already running.
That's a great analogy.
The telecommunications networks, the 5G towers, the massive fiber optic cables laid across the ocean floor, those act as the new digital nervous system for the innovation economy.
And these megaports, which are now heavily automated and handling hundreds of millions of containers, are the physical circulatory system.
This seems like a crucial point. You cannot decouple digital innovation from physical logistics.
You really can't. The countries that successfully escape the trap will be the ones that master the seamless integration of both. You need the data to move globally in milliseconds, but you also need the high-value, complex physical goods you are inventing to move efficiently across the planet.
Because if your ports are congested and your internet is slow, your patents are essentially worthless.
Exactly. You can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't manifest and ship them, you're stuck.
Okay, let's step back and look at the totality of what we've uncovered today. We started with the sheer awe of the economic miracle, the $30 trillion GDP, the total eradication of youth illiteracy, the unleashing of female economic power, and the profound gift of 34 extra years of human life.
It's an incredible achievement.
But we also trace the shadows cast by that exact same miracle, the irreversible liquidation of natural capital, the toxic air choking the very people who just won longer lives.
And the total collapse of the fertility rate, leading to a shrinking workforce and a crushing, unsustainable burden of elderly care.
When you synthesize this entire multi-decade journey, the final verdict on slide 15 is remarkably clear.
They've laid it out in this great quadrant matrix.
Yeah, on the left side, representing the old model, you have high emissions, high resource consumption, and reliance on the demographic dividend.
Yeah.
And they just put a massive X over it.
Because it mathematically cannot continue.
It must be totally permanently abandoned. These upper-middle-income countries have successfully completed the quantitative expansion. They ran the gauntlet from agrarian poverty to industrialized prosperity. But in doing so, they inherited massive structural imbalances.
So the new paradigm on the right side of the matrix with the check marks.
Right. The only viable path forward to achieve and sustain high-income developed status requires a massive dual transformation. First, they must lean entirely into continuous, aggressive R&D investment and the generation of elite human capital. High patents, high R&D.
And second, they must execute a ruthless, accelerated transition to green, low-carbon economics. They have to actively decouple economic growth from carbon emissions and resource depletion.
Bold text right in the middle. Dual transition of green and innovation.
This is no longer just an environmental luxury for rich countries to feel good about. It is a hard economic imperative.
Because if they don't clean the air and stabilize their ecology, the healthcare costs of an aging, chronically ill population, combined with the loss of their natural capital, will literally bankrupt the state before they ever achieve true high-income status.
It is a razor-thin tightrope to walk.
It really is. And analyzing this entire paradoxical journey leaves me with a thought that I want to pose directly to you listening right now. We've just spent this time breaking down how this incredible leap from crushing poverty to modern prosperity fundamentally required accumulating a massive environmental debt and lighting a demographic time bomb.
It seems like it was a package deal.
Exactly. So if a nation has to burn its environment and exhaust its youth just to escape poverty and get a seat at the global table, what happens when the next wave of developing nations tries to do the exact same thing?
That's the terrifying question.
What happens when the next 2 billion people in lower-income countries begin their sprint toward industrialization? The atmospheric math says the planet absolutely cannot handle another massive, carbon-fueled economic miracle.
But basic human morality says we cannot deny billions of people the clean water, the literacy, and the 34 extra years of life that come with that wealth.
So can the next wave of emerging economies somehow look at this data, learn from the UMC prosperity paradox, and leapfrog the dirty, exhaustive phase entirely? Can they go straight from agrarian poverty to a green, innovative, low-carbon future?
I certainly hope so.
Because if they can't, if every single nation has to take this exact same carbon-heavy, resource-liquidating path to survive, we are on a geopolitical and ecological collision course that will redefine the century. I'd leave you with that to ponder.
It is the ultimate bottleneck for our species. Always look past the headlines and keep questioning the mechanics behind the data. Thank you for joining the analysis.
We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.